Track 25. In Victorian times, the upper classes made up less than 3% of the entire population of Britain, yet this class held more than 90% of the country's wealth. This shows the massive gap there was between rich and poor, a gap which has shrunk considerably in the last century. Today, we're going to look at the wide differences in family life between rich and poor in Victorian times. Let's begin with the upper classes. The upper classes of the Victorian period were generally the nobility or the clergy. Most of their servants were very poorly paid, but were always accommodated within the homes of upper-class Victorian families, so they didn't have to pay for accommodation, food, and often clothing. The money which they did earn, they normally sent home to their families. Many Victorian servants came from the countryside, where the effects of the Industrial Revolution had resulted in job losses. Amongst these servants were cooks, housemaids, stable hands and butlers. The family would also employ a nanny, who, although employed by the family, was not traditionally seen as a servant. A nanny's primary role was to care for the children. She was responsible for teaching the children how to behave, looking after them when they were ill, and instilling discipline into them. Nannies did not, however, educate the children. Generally, children from wealthy families did not attend school outside the family home. Tutors would come to the house to do this, and although on occasion mothers taught their children to read and fathers gave their children some instruction in Latin, this was not a common occurrence. Now, the Victorian upper classes had the reputation of being quite cruel, but this wasn't always the case. They were also quite charitable. Ragged schools were set up with funding from the upper classes so that poor children could have some form of education. Additionally, most Victorian parents were very proud of their children, who were often seen as prized possessions. This goes against the common idea that parents were very hard on their children. In fact, the opposite was generally the rule. However, the situation for lower-class families was very different. In the lower classes, child labour was rife. Children, as young as 8, earned a living as chimney sweeps for wealthy houses. Now, let's move on to looking at the lower-class families in more detail. You'll find that very often Track 26. Section 4. You will hear a lecture on changes in family structure. First, you will have 20 seconds to look at questions 1 to 10. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 10.
We are all familiar with the nuclear family, which has been the dominant family structure in the UK for the last 60 years at least. However, recent changes show that our idea of the traditional nuclear family as the cornerstone of British family life is changing. There have been emerging patterns which are eroding this structure, namely the rise of step families, cohabitation, lone parenting, and the rapid increase in those living alone. We are going to explore these areas in turn and look at their effect in terms of the family. Firstly, step families are becoming more and more common. Step families are created when one or both partners have a child or children from a previous relationship. In 1980, the percentage of children under 13 who were living with one parent and their new partner was just 4%. In 2008, this figure had increased to 20%. The USA has seen an even greater rise. New statistics show that almost half of under 13s are living in a step family. Now, we can still call the step family structure a nuclear family, as it does follow the structure of two parents and dependent children. However, it also creates somewhat of a nuclear blur. Step brothers and sisters may belong to two family units, so where do we draw the line at which family they belong to? Cohabitation, when partners do not marry yet live together as a family, has also increased. In 2006, of the 17.5 million families in Britain, nearly 3 million of these comprised unmarried couples. What does this mean to the nuclear family? Firstly, the traditional view of a nuclear family requires married parents, so we can't put these types of family under this umbrella. Statistics show that even if cohabiting couples have children, they are more likely to separate than their married equivalents. Lastly, we need to look at the rise of the DINKs, which stands for Dual Income, No Kids. As Clark and Henwood outline, many cohabiting couples are choosing a life without children, putting consumer spending first. Lone parenting is a relatively recent family structure, which has rapidly grown in the last half-century. In 1972, only 1 in 14 children lived in a lone parent family. When we compare this with today's figure of 1 in 4, we can see that this is a rapid increase. In the past, lone parenthood was overwhelmingly the result of a death of a parent. Nowadays, however, it is increasingly a choice. Some sociologists argue that this increase is due to the outlook of women. Where women once were willing to accept an unhappy or abusive marriage, now many will choose lone parenthood. Often, this can be just a transitory phase before they find a new partner. This view of women's attitudes and lone parenting is highly debated because some figures show that the largest group of lone parents are mothers who have never married. You can find counter-arguments for these ideas in Butler and Jones. One difficulty for single parents is that they are a social group who are much more likely to suffer from poverty and hardship. They are more likely to live in rented accommodation and have childcare issues. Lastly, an increasing number of people are choosing to live alone. The number of people living alone in Britain has more than doubled in the last 20 years. In 1990, just over 4 million people lived alone. Now this figure has reached 8.5 million, an incredibly rapid growth which has had enormous effects on the traditional nuclear family. This number represents a great chunk of the population who, either by choice or necessity, are outside the traditional family unit. Some think that these changes may not help the community. In fact, there are many arguments that this rise in alternative household structures will create a more isolationist and less community-based society, where close bonds, which are usually formed within the family, have no place. Leaving aside whether or not the housing even exists for this boom, an important factor which must be looked at is the disproportionate expense for those living on their own. By this, I mean the burden of all costs is shouldered by one wage instead of two, and of course, one person is using the energy which could be shared between a group, having a greater impact on the environment too. However, on a more positive note, people, especially women, are proving to be extremely...
That is the end of the listening test. In the exam, you will have half a minute to check your answers.